Okay, fantastic. So this is the art session of A-Life 24, and I am Mando Sudefelt. I've been curating the show that is upstairs called Boundary Iconology together with Claire Lanois. It has been a wonderful process. We're very happy about it. And in this art session, we'll be treated by a reading by Mochu from his book, who is also showing a video in the show, and a discussion with Mochu, Pete Lewis, and myself that we're also very much inviting you all to come and join, because hopefully we'll touch upon some relevant topics for the field of artificial life. But I was going to begin to just ask no, I'm joking. Art as it could be. What are we dealing with when we're asking what art is? I think what art is a terrible question, because it is a little bit like what life is. We're working very hard and we're not finding out exactly what those things are. So I prefer to think about art in terms of aesthetic questions, like what kind of questions can we address by the means of aesthetics? And how do they function and where do they take us? So to just prime the space, I will just like give my own personal view on those things. It's not very personal though, but so like aesthetics can be thought of the science of the sensible, or it can be thought of how reality is being made available to us. Or it can be thought of as the relation between sense data and subjectivity. Or it can be thought of as the relation between percepts and concepts. So in all of these, we have a sort of, we're walking across a boundary between an external world and an internal world. And aesthetics, in my view, and the view I think is the relevant view of aesthetics, it takes place all the time. In analogy to science, you can say like, whatever, my cells are dividing all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I am aware of it or I'm trying to learn something about my cell division. That's the job of the scientist. That's what the discipline of science is doing, to isolate that such phenomena and trying to understand in its full-fledged form. And you can think about art as a sub-discipline of aesthetics in this way, that art is trying to understand what this relation between concepts and percepts are, but trying to reduce it to a scientific genre. Many people would disagree, obviously, with this. So in that way, you can say that aesthetics it's about feelings, it's about affects, but it's also about abstractions. And when you speak about like what are the sites of aesthetics, where does it culminate? It is both in a personal view, it's both in your experiential reality, like if you're watching a piece of art, or if you're watching, I don't know, like Double Rainbow, for example, that's like a good example of a strong aesthetic experience, you can say. But it can also be, it doesn't have to be a strong personal experience to deal with aesthetics. It can also be about creating new concepts, about putting things together that doesn't belong together, or corrupting things that are supposed to be clean, or making clean things, or making things clean that are supposed to be corrupt. And in this way of depersonalizing aesthetics, there is one of the big debates in the arts discourse right now, and that is the question of, can art be knowledge? Or what is the relation between art and knowledge? And this is something we can maybe, we're not going to answer that right now. But for me, like Mochu's work does both of this personal and the unpersonal experience. It's a deeply anxiety-inducing experience to watch his movies. We'll see how the reading goes. There's like a feeling of some paranoid rhythm coming into your veins, and there is probably 100,000 very interesting concepts that is being developed by Mochu's science fictional practice. So I'll invite Mochu to read a passage from, I think it's 10-15 minute reading from Besma Delikans from Sternberg Press, 2022. And then we'll kick a little conversation off after this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mandus. It's nice to see all of you here. So as he explained, this is a book I wrote in parallel with the video that's up in the art space. And yeah, I'll just be reading an excerpt from it. There's a thin layer of narrative with some characters and stuff in it, which may escape the reference, but I think that's not really something to worry about. So let's start. So one of the characters is called Dur Matter. That's just a name. And if you hear that term, it's just something outside the context. Anyway, so here we go. So if interstellar sociology had ever taught Dur Matter anything, it was that for every wayward spine there had to be a corresponding tentacle. Tentacles that moved over nations, Rockefeller tentacles, Syrio-comic tentacles, Churchill tentacles, Red Communist tentacles, Imperial Russia tentacles, Standard Oil tentacles, Imperial Japan tentacles, Great Britain tentacles, landlordism tentacles, dollar tentacles, God and gorillas tentacles, all eating the globe, squeezing the globe, strangling the globe, with their spherical victim suffocating, stung, and depleted. Upon pleading to their ancestors for invaluable guidance on cosmic suffering, all that mankind got in reply were flopping noises. The true ancestors being shapeless, mindless amoeba or some trilobite at the base of the ocean, sniffing sulfur in millennia-long darkness. Tentacles stood for that too, for time before time, the old ones, the endless that recursively ends in itself, backing upon all that contingency humming about. Spectral projections matter. Tentacles doubled as ghostly linkages. Bottom of the sea as bottom of the mind. Lenin's peak tentacle fetish was when the spectral parallels to big capital got realized as the crawling potentiality of the First International. Oil pipelines winding through deserts and jungles. French, Belgian, British, and German capital digging the railroads in Brazil and India. The spread of German banks in Argentina and Uruguay. The tentacles took form in Lenin's mind as a direct replica of imperial finance capital. The second and third versions of the International also followed the same model, all of them tentacular in their multi-limbic reach, covering the earth, albeit ghostly, unlike the original meaty capital that inspired its DNA. As noted by C.L.R. James, each of the three great workers' internationals corresponds in form to a particular stage of capitalism. They long remained figments before taking shape as organizations, at the time seen by imperial powers as some kind of bodiless terror that needed urgent containing. Spectres, unlike the trappings of infrastructure with all the grimy weight of flesh and coal and metal, have the unique oniric dynamism to capitalize on the future. The conundrum of the Skultopus animates this obscene historical concurrence of the forces of revolution with the forces of finance capital through a formal collision of the inclinations of ontology with that of the weird. The writer China Miéville says, the outstanding synecdoche signifier for a revenant human dead is the skull. Mind seat now empty-eyed, memento mori grinning, screaming. The non-parallel iteration of the embodied weird is the tentacle. And by suspiciously perfect chance, the most weirdly mutable, formless of all tentacled animals is the octopus, the body of which, a bulbous, generally roundish shape, distinguished by two prominent eyes, is vaguely homologous with a human skull. The shapes are ready and take little to combine. The weird ontological monster is clearly a tentacled skull. Spectral tentacle turns human skull, fleshy capital turns tentacle. A vicious wheel ancient like the old ones, its cold indifference incubating in high-pressure deep sea, itself a torpid surveillance that turns one raving mad through mere awareness of its existence. Leviathan with tentacles of steel, as the farmer Annixter describes, the Southern Pacific Railroad, and Frank Norris, The Octopus, A Story of California. Not the kind of thing one would want to buck against. The railroad threatens the California farmers as a great monster, iron-hearted, relentless, infinitely powerful. Yet intentions remain ambiguous, as there is no individual mind behind the steel tentacles. The railroad thinks itself into existence, its construction being fundamentally a feat of legal fiction engineering, somewhat altogether without a substance, as Joseph Conrad describes the iconic anthropomorphic embodiment of the enormous mythical power of the corporation, the phantom Colonel Kurtz. No density of equatorial fauna in Heart of Darkness therefore matches up to the insidious slithering of the corporate contract that binds Charles Marlowe in his journey into the Congo. The dexterity and power of the corporation's organs far exceed the ecological immensity of the tropical geography, sometimes almost to the point of appearing demonic in the theological sense. The lunatic horror of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mirrors this divergent vibe coherence of tentacular distributed intelligence across both corporations and the revolutionary organizations. Encounters of such incompatible states of being frequently manifest in Lovecraft's tales as unspeakable or indescribable creatureliness that harbors triggers of irreversible psychological derangement in human subjects. Crowd formations are infamous for their unnerving display of how individual minds shed intentions rapidly in unison with no determinate provocation or purpose in sight. Elias Kennedy calls this discharge, where large masses of people come to an unspoken automated agreement towards a common goal at extreme speed by a timely release of differences, a collective abandonment of individual intentionality. A wave-like synaptic intelligence possesses the crowd. In fact, there is no crowd before the discharge. This is the moment, start of quote, this is the moment when all who belong to the crowd get rid of their differences and feel equal, end of quote. Through discharge, the crowd reconfigures the societal limitations from proximity, thereby desolidifying the parameters of distancing between bodies. Resembling some kind of decentralized martial art, it's a form of bonding through emptying. Reproduction or multiplication is achieved through systematic reduction to arrive finally at the outright elimination of the individuated unit. The peak vibe is of equality. Conversely, the distinctive cephalopod tactic of discharging ink as an escape mechanism is exemplary of the way the distancing apparatus of bureaucracy is mobilized as a labyrinthine facade of inked paperwork, the great chain of stains that legitimizes all actions of collective persons, of fictional persons without intent and body. Just as the fluid contamination of ink in water enables the liquidity of creaturely presence, the mingling materiality of seals, signatures, bonds, letters, stamps, and fiber optic signals liquidates the responsibility of corporate personhood. The entire imperial colonial apparatus and its far-reaching infrastructural interventions in colonies, vassal states, and zones of mandate at the turn of the 20th century were operationalized through the very same strategy. This obscurantist program of bureaucratic ink secretion is dialectically mirrored by the darkness of carbon emissions unleashed by industrial capitalism that, in a slyly contrarian gesture of karmic ejaculation, reveals a formative morphology for corporate intentionality in the nonlinear dynamics of factory smoke, forest fires, oil spills, and microplastic swarms. It was the zeitgeist, stuff of the wind, like the awful stench of salt and fish that wafted over that suburban American afternoon. Shadows were long with the bright, orangish sun beating down on the narrow street, clicking with the sound of the approaching donkey hooves. Slow and lumbering in the siesta quiet, carrying their strange, loaded bags. Heading them was Ali Baba in turban and long robe. Up close, he was fully damp, even dripping wet, the air rich in marine flavors. As the bunch came to a halt outside the window, the pool of water collecting around Ali Baba's feet slowly led Jonathan's eyes to the hideous pinkish slime perspiring behind the trader robes. Shiny bulbous spots, lumps, hooks, and hypnotic spiraling formations, inhaling and exhaling. The monopoly octopus was here, sliding its tentacles out onto the street, slithering across pavements and asphalt, its scheming many brains all over, crawling, offering its donkey trust to the United States. It was a disgust fest, all in all, a soulless carnival of hydrostatic musculature, emerging from some dephased universe pitifully hidden from all humanity. The ink that it secreted onto the paperwork clouded more than it explained, with all the dubious mercantile exchanges promised. "I don't like your looks, Mr. Merchant. You'd better move on," says Jonathan in a blatant refusal of the offer. This is a cartoon from 1888, drawn by William Allen Rogers for Harper's Weekly. The American public of the late 19th century sees the corporation as an abomination as unreliable and inhuman as the cunning foreigners milling around their cities, taking away their jobs, lands, women, men, in short, all their wealth. But at the same time, neither actively commits crimes, for they are without a mind or soul like automatons. Such designs of automatic criminality inform the paradox of Schrodinger's immigrant, who's constantly stealing all the jobs while also being too lazy to work. The barbarian imaginary both converged and clashed with the working class imaginary. The sole exception being the people outside of history anyway, the people who never qualified for human status, assembled in the vast colonial plantations, mines, law firms, civil service schools, and military trenches, pulped at the ground zero of the Anthropocene into industrial carbon, mineral mixtape, mashed meat, and smoked out to the Earth's darkening atmosphere. The biotechnological fantasy that civilization could pop up spontaneously without the resistance of history is brought to its comic conclusion in theories of ancient aliens or similar panspermic origin speculations, which identify all of humanity to be of extraterrestrial technological genesis. Sentient extraterrestrial interventions legitimize the presence of evolutionary trajectories that are formed without the inertia of either rationality or circadian rhythm, both taken to be anomalies within the otherwise smooth sweep of expanding civilizational desire. Extractive wish fulfillment as meteor spermatozoa. Human history as cosmic catastrophe. The post-war flying saucers of the Third Reich, buried in underground Antarctic bunkers, are ideological concentrates of this sentiment. Unlike their enigmatic kin in the American Midwest, these are over-identified flying objects, unhappy flying objects. Unhappy consciousness is the scream that no one hears in outer space at that critical moment when the barbarian erupts from inside the colonizer in a splatterfest of imperial defacement. In Lev Sixtin's novel, The Three-Body Problem, the trisolaran fleet on its way to colonize Earth from its distant planet sends subatomic probes called Sophons to Earth in advance of his 450-year-long journey here, with the express purpose of preventing any further terrestrial development of fundamental sciences by humans during that period. Was there any particle that could, like the Sophon, prevent the evolution of fundamental components of ideology? Given enough time, are there particles that could fluctuate into concepts directly? In Liu's book, The 1960s Cultural Revolution in China is the start of a chain of mass resentment percolating through generations, a disillusion with the promises of class liberation. Tired of the wretched concerns of the earth, one of the employees of the Chinese space program, in a decisively vengeful act, relays radio signals that reveal Earth's fragile location to an alien civilization, leading to the original call for invasion. The signal is an invitation to colonize and set things right, even if that critical corrective gesture might be the complete extermination of the inviting party. The act triggers a whole chain of interplanetary Darwinism that constitutes the novel and its sequels. The technological superiority of the invading aliens on which the colonizing potential is hinged is, however, essentially a product of their biological natural circumstances. Consequently, this advantage possessed by the invaders is parasitically instrumentalized by the subject race for its own radical imagination of freedom, which is through a collective call for suicidal subjection. Paradoxically, though, it is a cultural revolution that sets the ground for even just the scope for such a reaction, the ability to seize the means to suicide at an unprecedented cosmic scale. Through this act of treason and deceit with regard to collective human destiny, the subject group merges with its technological extensions that result from the invader's biologically determined advantage, thereby upgrading into a techno-parasite par excellence. But again, the very dependency on the biological superiority of the distant civilization is no different from just bribing a bully. The a priori premise is to acknowledge their superhumanity as a given, and then to mobilize it to release humans from totalitarian bondage. Speculations before the Russian Revolution had probably anticipated this kind of reactionary rebound of racial consciousness in the making of history. Alexander Bogdanov had written that workers of the world would unite instinctively through an intersubjective human consciousness, and the function of the Communist Party should be to assist them in this through offering political direction and mass education. The means of production needs to be seized at the subatomic level. Technological superiority need not be a function of biologically deterministic exosomatization, but a result of sociologically informed particle interactions. These particle accelerator ideas, powered on the energies of class consciousness, got Bogdanov sent into exile when, after the revolution, Lenin won the party with advice to his friend to just stick to science fiction and not bother with political change, and impose the socialist dictatorship. Bogdanov's ideas proceeded on other paths, dispersing further through Trotskyist internationals. A zombie recapitulation of Bogdanov's ideas was soon run through a kaleidoscopic history shredder by the Argentinian Trotskyist leader J. Posadas as part of his organizational manifestos in the Fourth International Posadist. Posadas saw UFOs as an indicator of advanced civilizational development in other planets and in other galaxies, an evident sign, according to him, that communism thrived in deep space. Dysfunctional Nazi machines rusting about unhappy in the Antarctic bunkers were no match for the shimmering communist alien crafts. Eva Braun's post-war vacations in Patagonia were just colorful house arrest dioramas sponsored by exoplanet socialist museum funds. The question of energy, Kardashev scales, super-civilization sociologies, all an ethereal light beam on a pampas cow. Spaceship as space opera comradeship. In a bout of nostalgia in the later days of his life, surrounded by his friends, Posadas expressed the desire to have an archive of his work. Citing the history of the international, Latin American politics in general, the Olympic Games in Moscow, and the memories of his family, all these being signs that the world was organizing around the sentiment of socialism. He noted that even birds outside his window were having meetings on the subject. Soon all animals would live side by side in peace, particularly the dolphins. There's going to come, start of quote, there's going to come 2 dolphins to my side. You'll see. I'm going to manifest the desire to be helped, accompanied and taught by the dolphins, and they're going to come. Okay, thank you guys. Questions?
Thank you so much, Machu.
Suggestions? Anarchic responses, anything?
What is the Tegesitos, if you like, or please remain. Like, I was going to ask you, what is this post-Posadist movement? And like, it's populated by these dolphins and the birds, and there is some sort of suggestion of an interspecies equality.
Yeah. So I mean, partially the stuff which was there was about Posadas, who was an Argentinian Trotskyist. So after several years of active political life, he was basically got caught up in some discourse on extraterrestrial activity and its potential for liberating mass liberation. So in 1968, he wrote this very well-known piece called Flying Saucers, the Process of Matter and Energy, Science, the Revolutionary and Working Class Struggle, and the Socialist Future of Mankind, in 1968. So in that, there was a kind of very strangely radical claim of comradeship across galaxies, I mean, why just limit your mass activation to simply the Earth or simply your community or social? So there was a kind of very radical approach to thinking about solidarity, because you cannot eliminate or exclude anything from a true solidarity. So in that sense, so he also expanded these ideas into including birds, as he noted in his journals, as well as a significant part of it was devoted to discourse on dolphins, and how he would always visit zoos with children and that kind of a thing. But this is much later in his practice. He had a long practice, political practice, before this phase started in his life. And I think but I think the main consequence for him was that he lost the votes. But it was an active sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's a very radical dissolution of categories, especially, and also like when you're connecting it to the material in Bogdanov's thesis, that we have to have equality on a subatomic level even.
Yes.
Which is a very interesting sort of dissolution of what counts within.
Sure. Even this meme, actually, this is something that resurfaced recently when the orcas started attacking ships, and they're also the same cetaceans. I mean, like whales, orcas, and dolphins. So there was a lot of sort of, you could say, the political left spectrum memes, which discuss the fact that the anti-capitalist move by the orcas. So that meme was one of those, and but also the Posadism became a little bit important in this context, in sort of civilizational theater played out on the internet. That it became the language of the alt-right, or the kind of reactionary politics on the web, has a particular sort of countercultural vein, which the actual counterculture or the actual leftist politics had lost. But I think the Posadist discussion brought back this real weird sort of xenophilia across all sorts of boundaries. So I think that's when it sort of had some attention in relation to a lot of the stuff that emerged during the first Trump elections in the United States. And then it spread everywhere. So usually because United States is the English-speaking sort of center. So.
Yeah.
But it has its manifestations everywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how those weird images and structures, if you want to extend if you want to dissolve the categories, how you're ending up with dolphins, but then you're also ending up with the tentacular, and you're also ending up with blobs suddenly as well within your concept of solidarity, or whatever you like to call it. Mm-hmm. These are the taxonomical, and they have like internet subcultures that goes on. And then we're also in a place where the blob subculture is also taking place on a visual cultural level, that is artificial life, where we're doing a lot of blob stuff. And I think you're writing in the book and in the video, there is the tentacular outside Lovecraftian tentacular. And could you just like, what is cosmic horror in that sense? Because there is like this cosmical tentacles that gets a grip on things. And then after that, I would like to speak about this in relation to the blobs in general.
I mean, I think that maybe Peter can come in, but I can also just finish the little bit that was already there in the reading. So I think I don't know, for those who are familiar with the works of the American writer H.P. Lovecraft, there was a kind of interest in the works of Lovecraft in relation to unthinkability, incomputability, and philosophy. But maybe 10 years back, it was there in the Anglo-American sort of scene for a short while. But apart from that, I think that the thing was that there was some interest in the limitations of what is irreducible to our relation to something, like, so how to think on the unthinkable in that sense. So I think the tentacular horror, which was kind of often in Lovecraft's books, you would have these kind of stories of creatures which are indescribable or unspeakable, unseeable. These kind of, negative qualifications are the way to sort of experience those. And I think it was a kind of pioneering style at that time, after Edgar Allan Poe and so on, to develop a kind of language for the fear emerging due to the sense of progress, scientific development, and modernity in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century when Lovecraft lived. So I think that's where sort of it started, but then it moves to, so it expands, it's a large set of things which includes everything from deep sea creatures, weird insects, to blobs, to algae, or whatever it is, So, so any sort of slime molds. So a lot of this discussion entered the arts as well. It's been there for a while, but there was a lot of books about it. So I think that informed. Peter.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come and join this panel as well. I also wanted to start by saying I really appreciate that you put on this exhibition here and that to show this work. And one of the things I really appreciate about the A-Life community is that we do have regularly, we have art feature as part of the conference, and this is not something that we see at many conferences that I go to. And I think one of the reasons why I value that and appreciate that is precisely because it enables this kind of other sort of reflection in people. I'm not an artist, right? I'm a researcher, maybe a scientist, I don't know. But it enables this ability to reflect on things like the aesthetic questions of the work that you're doing. So I wanted to pick up on this negativity that you characterized really well, both through the reading and through what you said subsequently. Negativity associated with blobs and tentacles and this kind of thing, which is, I think, a very common reaction, right? So my reaction visiting the artworks ranged from repulsion to uncanniness and feelings like this, right? But I think what's really powerful is that a lot of the same sort of imagery we actually see present in the scientific research work that we've seen in the slides, right? As we've gone through and in the demos and things like this. Those who've been around A-Life for a while will know, if you've been into some of the talks, you'll see some of the same kind of imagery. But I think that one of the things that's potentially quite interesting then about this community is that this seems like, to some extent, maybe this is a question, are we bucking that trend of, feeling repulsed by these things in a Lovecraftian way and actually embracing the blob and saying, the blob is something that we're trying to design or to build. One wonderful example, I think, was from Kohei Nakajima's talk, keynote, where, the tentacle-like thing is, it's not just something that we're kind of looking at askance, but it's actually, can we just build a computer with it, right? So it's like we're asking questions like that, rather than being repulsed, we're saying we're kind of bringing it in, right? And trying to integrate it into our systems. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of one of the reflections that I had from this, and wondering if that's a feature that maybe this community has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that,
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, I was just noting it in a historical sense. Also, I was meaning that there's something about the attribute of the weird or this kind of a blob becomes eventually something that is identified through its impossibility in a sense. That's what also I meant by negative in the sense of not just a negative experience or negative emotion associated, but also the fact that you cannot. It's characterized by the inability to access it, or you know, that sort of thing. Yeah, anyway, but
And this question of possibility, I think, is really interesting because I think you briefly touched on progress, right? And in the reading as well, I was interested. I hadn't read this before, and I was interested that this assumption of the seeing the UFOs meant that these aliens must have achieved this particular form of progress, right? That was the assumption that people had brought to it, and I think that really that made me start to think about what is progress. And how do we think about that in art and in science? And one of the things in thinking for this panel was we were having conversations, weren't we, about how art and science relate to each other and how they support each other and inform each other or inspire each other. And we could talk about science-inspired art, perhaps, but this question of progress, I think we often think in science in terms of progress being perhaps a sequence of contributions, or a tree of contributions or something like that. And then we have, obviously, through the institutions and the structures that we create within science, we have very formal kind of sets of rules about what constitutes a contribution, right? So even down to the mundane things like the processes of peer review and how we record things through papers and all these kind of rituals, right? And then I think it becomes quite natural to look back on that because we can't look forward. So look back on that kind of sequence of contributions, almost in a kind of, I don't know if people are familiar with the idea of Whig history. It's something that comes out of British kind of politics. Butterfield coined the term, and it's this idea that actually progress is kind of this forward march towards some sort of future, right? It's sort of teleological thing, and you're just kind of off you march towards this. And that means that the choices that we make as scientists are simply about choosing which parts of that space to ask questions about next, perhaps, right? And the assumption that once we've kind of filled in all the pieces, we complete the jigsaw puzzle, and that kind of constitutes progress, right? And this is kind of doing that. And I think this is probably not true, right? And so this is certainly not true in art. And this is something that I think that encourages us to ask those kinds of questions, to deconstruct that a little bit in science, right? To be able to ask questions like, what are the possibilities of, say, taking a tentacle and embracing that, right? This seems to me to be fundamentally quite a transformative creative act, not just something that's kind of gap filling, which is often the way we talk about scientific contribution. So I think it raises all these questions about progress and creativity and attitudes. Yeah.
Yeah, the Whig history of the scientific progress in its crude version is really, the third is quite, doesn't map very well onto the actual fields in many cases. But I know, like in your work, there's a lot of different kinds of temporalities at play, for example. And I know there's, for example, the Afrofuturist temporality, and like one interesting inspiration is just to how to merge different forms of temporality into also an idea of scientific practice more than progress in a way.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, I mean, art historically, there have been several futurisms, a lot of which are considered to be quite disastrous in terms of, again, same thing about the direction of progress. One classic one being Italian futurism, which in the 40s proposed the destruction of all things, and therefore, and the movement towards the future is a kind of elimination of everything else, which is a kind of probably satirical, but also a highly aestheticized form, but also, telling in this in its manner in which it's unable to think of the future without the linear direction. I think the Afrofuturism that mentioned is an interesting case where the constitutive example of the constitutive experience of modernity was disregarded as being something that Europe arrived late at, but were actually felt by the subjects of the transatlantic slave trade. So, in the sense of the alienation, the existential questions actually occurred to the slaves first. And modernity happened to those subjects instead of and by virtue of this, what happens is that the entirety of the future, by entirety of the world, which is excluded from the slavery, is sort of pushed out of this context into, so basically the subjects of the slave trade become ahead of time and therefore is situated in the future, while the rest of the world is actually behind time. And in this manner, the futurism was quite interestingly constructed, and which actually, sort of reverts this story of progress. So the scientific, it's about who. It's not just about it's not just about the progress universal, but I guess it's also about who is subjectified to that progress and in what way. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of one of the examples. There are several artistic futurisms. Which
There is a lot of different, and I think it's interesting to think about the sort of the temporal concepts at play. For example, when you're going to minimal forms of intelligence, you're trying to recreate something from scratch. Like, what temporality is created there is a question that I'm baffled by. If this is a futuristic effort, or if it's a nostalgic effort, or if it's like, in what sort of time space does that occur in a way? That is very much at play here at Artificial Life. And I think there is a big overlap between artistic work and scientific work in that space, because no one knows what's the temporal concept at play. That's essentially where it's very much up for grabs.
Yeah.
I think also we will please join the discussion. What do you think about the blobs, guys? I know a lot of you guys are making blobs in the computer or in the lab.
Just a comment to your point about, it also, I think Artificial Life people also think orthogonally, right? So it doesn't necessarily have that nostalgic part or the futuristic part. It's just going off in a tangential direction. This is also a way when I'm seeing these talks, how I'm thinking about it. Although they are context related, but it might be just also tangential, orthogonal.
Yeah, and I'm picking up on this progress and time thing. I think that, first of all, shout out to the workshop on time. That
was great.
That was excellent. And so go look at those the papers from those people. So I'm not going to comment really on that, because there were people who know far more about it than me that were there and did that. But I do think, there are some really obvious things that if you're in part of A Life, you know, which maybe are not part of common understanding. So just things like, the fallacy of things being like sort of, more evolved or something like that, right? So when we start to talk about the progress of evolution as not being something, it's very common, isn't it, to talk about kind of the most highly evolved creatures and being humans or something like this. And so we're very used to the fact that evolution doesn't work like that, right? I don't know, maybe based on your comment, maybe that's, is that mindset influencing the fact that, we just explore in different directions. We don't have this sense of linearity. So people are very happy to kind of go off in different directions and sort of see what emerges from that. Maybe I think it's probably a fair critique to say that a lot of perhaps more engineering driven fields are actually kind of really do have a sense of linearity to what they're trying to achieve. I've had several conversations with people about the kind of supposed pipeline from, theory through to application and, technology readiness levels, all the narrative around that, for example, which I'm sure many of us deal with when we're doing grant proposals and things. So I just think it's interesting, how different communities or different cultures, different scientific cultures have these sort of different sort of framings for what constitutes direction and progress. But yeah, I've been to more questions.
Sure. I'm really interested in that kind of
Thank you, Machu.
art. Yeah, so from the standing point of life research, it's a fundamental motivation of life research is that we want to know what life is, you know. So then apply this principle to the art, and then we want to know what art is. So then, so a methodology of life research is that let's try to make something art, but that's something different we know, different from we know. So, so we if we want to know art, and then we should conduct some any simulation or some installation by wetware or something that can emerge some artistic activity by artifacts, you know. So, so then I really want to push I'm really challenging such a field, but still not enough. So I want to promote such a direction of research and art activity to seek art for machine by machine or something like that.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting direction. There is some work being, like, firstly, I think for that direction to sort of take root, like if you're making the analogy with life, you're somehow discovering what life is. You're assuming that there is something outside in the world, in nature, if you may, that is described by the word life. And when you're thinking about, you can think about art in that way, and I think in the Western paradigm of art, you don't think about art in that way. Art is usually anthropomorphized in some way or another, or like has a human source. But in other artistic cultures that I'm not an expert, that's more of a present paradigm. But first you have to assume that art is something that you can discover. It has a natural component to it in one way. And then you can sort of find out what that component is. And then there are like a lot of artistic work being done right now on, for example, like machine vision, like operational images is like a very active concept in the art that I think is similar. That sort of derives artwork from machine vision, essentially, on the premise that these images are not made for human consumption. But then twisting that concept into some sort of strange contact with the machinic outside. Or you can also go back to classic, like high modernist theory, like Ortega y Gasset, like one of the famous art theorists from the early modernism, that speaks about how the best art is the art that eliminates the human, which was for quite some time a very influential way of doing it. And I think like we're in a position right now, like also in the merger of art and science, to like revisit these questions. But for my personal opinion, I would not like to just generate art as some big, huge machine. I would still like to, I don't know, not be a part of it as a human perhaps, but be a part of it as like the machine that I might be, in a way.
I think also, I think in art history, it's quite a, I mean, I think art has been quite obsessed with art that's not art and art that's not life. And a lot of art history is just that, in fact. Like, so I think that's pretty mainstream sort of a thing in arts. Although I don't think that's what its public image is. Like if you get a little bit into the thing, because like you said, modernism was largely about dehumanized experiences, and possibly out of out of your usual phenomenal sort of scheme. How does that work as an art? Is it still art, or art outside the earth and that kind of stuff? So I think that was quite interesting, but a nice way to think from the other.
If just connecting that question, because there is an interesting discussion also about like the difference between, for example, data visualization and whatever you like to call art in this context, that I think we spoke about earlier also.
Yeah, I was going to come in and mention this as well. Because
Yeah,
I think we've seen in the artificial life community and adjacent communities for a long time, I guess you might call it, say, nature-inspired art or something like this, right? So you get these kind of pig breeder type things, and then you also get this kind of approach where people are essentially, I think the one way of characterizing it would be that you're sort of exposing the inherent beauty of some natural or lifelike process through, for example, a projection or a filter in a way that enables people to interact with that underlying process. And these things have beauty, and this is why they're attractive fundamentally, right? But then, you know, we like to kind of quite casually label that art, what we're doing. And I kind of found myself wondering through the conversations we'd had whether the person doing that, are they the artist, or is nature the artist? Is it not art because of that, or is it that is it some kind of collaboration between, you know, physics and the person, or, you know, where's the intentionality? Questions like that. So I wonder if you've come across much of this, and what your kind of perspective is on that.
Yeah, I think that the removal of intentionality also has been an important driver for art history, within art history, because, for example, the chance art or art, surrealist art about like automatic writing, actually there's a good intersection with literature there, with modernist literature. So the removal of intentionality brings it in some form closer to the mechanized world of science, is sort of the premise, which is also, again, with its constraints. But I think that a lot of the automatic poetry, concrete poetry, conceptual art, these are schemes that actually go towards a scientific, or I don't think they go towards science in that sense, but I think it acknowledges the existence of science as a thematic and as a structuring principle within which art also operates, and it's a shared space in that sense. So they're trying to find a commons, intellectual commons, which include science as well as art, and not just a standardization. So I think that was where scientific imaging also comes in.
Exactly. I think that's, it's a lot of work to be done in that area still, and it's great to be just having these kinds of sessions in that, to build a concept between like the sort of generative, the nature inspired, the visualization driven image culture that exists, and on the other hand, maybe narrative driven.
Even the AI, the new stuff, AI imagery brings these, even however bad they are, but they bring this discussion back in some way. So that sense, intellectually interesting, although the actual things are horrible. But so it's, I think, sorry, as you were saying.
No? So I'd like to go back to the question of time. So our sort of starting premise in that workshop was this idea from Edmund Husserl in phenomenology that time in consciousness, right, in conscious experience, instead of being a sort of just a linear sequence of discrete steps, is linear in a sense, but it has this sort of texture of being a rolling now, right, which is not discrete. So it's holding in something more than memory, really, more present than memory, but like a holding on to what's just happened and always anticipating what's about to come. And so I kind of wanted the panel's opinion on, is that a nice alternative to the futurist view of progress as destroying everything and let's start again, and the Whig sort of very linear kind of, we're just totally going on, right? So maybe that still captures the sort of truth of progress, both in science and art, but allows it to be much more transformative than the Whigs would have it, I guess.
So thanks for the question. It's always a confusing thing, this time thing. But I guess in the cultural examples that I mentioned with the different type of artistic futurisms, I don't think there's any real thought about the direction of time. It's because it's more about how the subjectivity is positioned within the narrative of progress, which is anyway linear. By default, it's linear. So I think the complication of subjectivity produces the illusion of linearity in some way, in just probably the way that phenomenologically one might feel the time is passing or time is less or more or so much, so that much, to that degree. I don't think there is actually a technical consideration of why time moves forward and why is there thermodynamic entropy or why is there a sort of, asymmetry of time. I don't think it goes into the asymmetric idea. So yeah, I think that's what I figured maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something very briefly, just because and it was a really interesting workshop, and a lot of that was new to me. But I found that theory quite compelling as something that really speaks to the experience of time, personally. But I also found very useful in that the multiple timescales approach that was talked about as well, right? So I think there's the experience of time, which to me I guess does not seem to align directly with the notion of progress. They seem orthogonal things, right? So whereas when you start to think about time on a narrative time scale, then that's when you start to attribute meaning and value. And I think that's when notions such as progress or anti-progress and things can be attributed to it. But then that, again, it's obviously, it's subjective and it's value laden. So so maybe I don't know if how one experiences narratives, that's a different kind of thing than perhaps.
There's also a sort of small interruption, but the small short interest currently in financial practices and the speculation in finance, right? So the kind of future projections that abstract money and value and time together, so that in such a way that the entire logistical operations that actually produce or remove money are premised on a futurist kind of insurance program, right? Because you insure against things to such a degree that everything is planned to that. So the whole of logistical capitalism produces a different kind of parallel time, or I don't know how to explain it in words, but it is produces a different speculative zone. So financial speculation, then there's science fictional speculation, and there is actual technical idea of the future and past, and in terms of pure science. So I think this is kind of present in the arts now, to a large degree, like sort of analyzing financial practices as a way to think about the future, catastrophe, collapse, whatever that might be. Sorry, I interrupted. Continue.
Just to say, I mean, so I had the pleasure of attending a conference of hedge fund managers recently. It was a bit of a strange experience. But absolutely, some of the talks there, I mean, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was astounded to learn about the kinds of models and detail that goes into the modeling of these future scenarios, right? And including things like civilizational collapse and even more real things like climate change.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's so much weather simulations and like so much.
Yeah, and the quantification of all of that was it blew me away actually how much what it was like.
So the way I see art is like letting something out, kind of like maybe the first art is I see my hand, I put it on the wall, and I say there's something there, there's something within me here. And it seems like there's a similarity with artificial life or with science or all these other disciplines where it's like I see something about the world, I see something about me that I try to let out. I put it into its extreme form. It's like if I want to learn about something, I poke it, I heat it up, I stretch it out, I see what are all the far spaces of it. And it makes me think of this idea of if we keep on doing this, if we keep on trying to expand this, creation of ourselves, eventually we go beyond ourselves. Eventually, like the world speaks through us. Like we start saying, oh, well, I'm not only my hand, I'm also this amazing fractal thing, and I'm also this blob, and I'm also this universe. And through that, like nature speaks through us. And it seems like inevitable that if you just keep on pushing, eventually we have to just let go of ourselves, like ego death or something.
So are you asking about art in general, right?
Yeah, I'm right.
Okay.
I guess.
I think my hunch would not be that it's going to be beyond ourselves, but that we're going to have a new self-reference point. And that self-reference point might be like unimaginable for us in our present and psychoanatomical configuration. But I don't think we're going to get rid of, like, there is no beyond in that sense.
I think also more than,
in my world.
I guess more than just the expression of a given self that comes out, it also becomes a technical activity, right? Because it saves that self outside, so that even if the person whose hand it was dead, you feel that, or you can tap into that memory. So I think over time, this kind of exosomatized material builds up, and then that has its own sort of ontology. So I think then the reference point from where it started doesn't really matter. So therefore, you can have discontinuous starting points, or discontinuous cells, which can produce different forms of memory, of different type of retention and so on, I guess. So I think it's a kind of tied to the technical activity as a technical process.
Yeah, I see one possibility of going beyond ourselves, and the other is like creating ourselves. Like I almost think of that.
I mean, the self need not be a starting point. Yes, because you may also, once it gets into the technical domain, you don't need the self to look at the thing, because we cannot then differentiate. I think that's also the thing about artificial life discussion, is that we don't know if this is technologically made or artificially made, or is it life or what, those kind of very fundamental sort of questions. Bring it to this domain that, okay, what sort of memory is it? Or what does it do? What we were talking about this also, like, what, instead of what something is, what does it do? And therefore, how do you go? So in this manner, I think there are several ways to access it, but I think interesting question. Yeah, there's one more.
Yeah, related to that, I was part of an interesting conversation over dinner last night, talking about the relationship or the similarities between artificial life and queer culture and drag culture. So there have been various things written about this in the 90s and early 2000s, at least a couple of books I have read on that, and sort of pointing out that they're both attempts to explore different forms of living. And I would need to go back and read the books, but it seems to me that that's another example of the idea of artificial life as looking at orthogonal ways of being alive, as we were speaking about earlier, rather than being a temporal thing. But yeah, it seems to me that's just another point of connection with this whole discussion.
Yeah, of course. I think that's really perfect, because I think it's also about the understanding of non-homogeneity in things, and also respecting that sort of project of moving across domains. That's sort of in a broad sense. But I think of course, as a radical political stance, also it's a great point. But I think it's similar to, I think the efforts make it that way, the kind of artificial life concerns.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really interesting connection to make, and I think it just highlights all these reflections. Really, I think they've just helped to kind of highlight how the nature of the work that we do is fundamentally creative, and not in a way that like I'm building things, like I'm building airplanes or something. But creative in terms of ideas and stretching the envelope, and not just like come back to my jigsaw puzzle analogy. We're kind of building out and imagining what might be out of the picture, and not just trying to find out what's in the detail of the picture. And these kind of there's various different ways. I think it's nice to be reminded. Again, I'll come back to my comment about appreciating the fact that we bring this kind of conversation into what can be quite a technical conference, right? Because it does give us the opportunity to reflect on the kind of creative nature of the work that we do as well.
Yeah, sure. It's also like something about non-determinism, no? That technology or science or art, how does it take a stance towards not claiming some form of deterministic position in terms of essentialist positions, I guess. which is probably the most important thing about what you were saying.
Are there more questions? Or I think we're already 11 minutes.
Any more questions? It's
past
okay, we've
6
gone
here,
forever, but yeah.
Maybe we have time for a little bit one. Or otherwise, we're gonna open it for the academic karaoke. Which seems to be a wonderful event. I just got to learn what it was about. It seems hilarious. Okay, we have one last question.
Oh, there's one question, the last one.
Yeah, just on the note of academic karaoke, you are all invited. It will be in the scroll bar. Come there. It will be super fun. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, I think we're concluding the art session of A-Life 24. The exhibition is still on tomorrow as well. Do take a look at it. And do come and continue the conversation. There is a whole lot of threads that are open, and I think some of them are very important to keep on, to latch onto and not let go of. So thank you, Pete. Thank you, Moccio, for joining this. And thank you, Claire, for co-curating the show.
Thank you, Claire.
And the whole A-Life team, and we see you around.
Thanks to everyone.